So, welcome to another episode of the Keeping It Together podcast. Today, I am joined once again by the wonderful Dr. Hilary Johnson. Hi, Hilary. It's really lovely to have you back. We have done a couple of episodes, kind of going back to basics, is kind of what we're calling this mini series that I'm doing with you. And the first one, we looked together at anxiety. We were kind of unpacking a bit about what anxiety is. And then we took some time unpacking depression and what is depression and how does it affect us. The next thing that I would really love to talk to you about is something that I think we're hearing a lot more of, even in this podcast over the last few sessions. We've talked about this, but it's something that I think a lot of people don't understand, and that's the topic of trauma. So it's a word that we're hearing a lot. Lots of services, charities are becoming more trauma informed, and we've talked a little bit about that on the podcast with other guests. But I would love to go right back to basics with you, if that's okay, and actually ask you, well, what is trauma? Let's talk about what that word really means. Is it just when something bad happens to you, or is it a little bit more complex than that? What is trauma?
I think a lot of us are familiar with the word, so we'll hear about the trauma room in A&E, or we'll just say, "Oh, yes, that they're recovering from their trauma," and so we might envisage, for example, physical damage done to
Sure.
somebody, a car accident, or something awful like that, where you can often see the damage externally. As a doctor, when people come who've been in a serious car accident, they can look all right. They may not actually have an obvious trauma, but then we will start to look for the signs and symptoms that there may be something deeper inside. And so a classic one might be, for example, you may have heard of the spleen. It's something that sort of cleans the blood and helps our immunity. But if you're in a car accident and you damage in your abdomen, it may not be obvious that you've ruptured your spleen. And that's why when you're in hospital, they would do things like your blood pressure and your heart rate. And the doctors will discern, and they might do scans, and then they realise, gosh, this person who just looks a little bruised has a really serious injury, and we need to treat it. And we need to treat it quickly because it could impact them for the rest of their lives, if not kill
Right.
them. So that's something with a physical level. And we talked before about how we are physical, spiritual, and psychological beings.
Yeah.
You can't separate it. So you know if you're in a traumatic car accident, there's an emotional impact of that. All of us would expect that.
Yeah.
We can grasp it. And trauma that can affect us psychologically, again, is one of those difficult things to see externally. Sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it isn't. And a person may be suffering from trauma and not quite know that it is trauma that is behind their suffering. So in my role, I would want to discern when somebody comes who is suffering from a mental health perspective, or suffering in their relationships, or suffering generally. They're just not thriving. And I would want to, one of the questions going through my mind would be, what trauma may have occurred that this person may or may not be aware of.
Yeah, I
Okay.
was going to say, because
So,
sometimes we can look back and go, oh, yes, for example, I was in a car accident and I've recovered from my physical trauma, but there's an emotional or psychological trauma that stems, and we can pinpoint the thing that happened that's made us fearful of driving, for example. Um, but there's maybe some things like you were alluding to there that we are not aware of. So there's some things that we can point to and say, yep, that was a traumatic event. And some things have traumatized us, maybe more under the radar. Is that what you're saying?
yes. Yes, I think so. I think that's a helpful way to think about it. So, you know, so the trauma is not the event itself. So the car accident isn't the trauma, but the trauma is what happens inside the person, physically, mentally, spiritually, as a result of an event. And the first level of signs and symptoms that we might see when it comes to emotional trauma is that a person experiences that sense of overwhelm, that sense of helplessness, and maybe a sort of disconnection from themselves or others or God. Those are the classic sort of three elements that you would see. And so, for example, you talking about the car analogy, even if you don't drive, you know that if you press the accelerator, you go fast. If you press the brake, you stop. And when people are in trauma, sometimes it's a bit like both pedals are pushed disproportionately, and the smoothness of addressing the requirements are not there. So it may be that the accelerator's on the whole time, and you just like are on go go go. You're on high alert. You're really really stressed. Or it could be that the only way you're coping in a situation that becomes slightly triggering or stressful for you is that you put the brakes on, you disconnect, you go into a completely like detached, and that there, we get those two extremes that are to do with how our nervous system and how our psychological system have potentially been impacted. So trauma is more common than we think or on first arising. So there's big trauma, there's big T, which would be the things I've talked about: a major car accident, war, obvious abuse where somebody's clearly been injured, life-threatening illnesses. Um, then there's little trauma, which aren't so obvious, and we are both the scientific world, the psychology world, and Christian world are becoming aware of how the little trauma, the one that's harder to necessarily pinpoint, that's the event that I was
Yeah.
traumatized by, therefore that's why I've got this feeling. Those things can arise often in our early years, but even as adults, and often within relationship context, where we may be in an environment that is chronically stressful. Now, we might not realize that it is stressful because we learn to adapt to it. If you live in a noisy environment, you don't quite notice how noisy it is. But if you come out of a quiet room into that noisy environment, you haven't adapted and it feels more of a shock. And the same to going from a really noisy environment to a quiet room, the contrast is so huge. And if somebody's lived in a noisy, emotionally noisy environment where there is constant stress, and it may be a parent that's always worried because they're really struggling financially, it may be the chronic nature of what leads up to a very painful divorce, the impact on those adults, the impact on maybe children in that family. It could be medical procedures that somebody had as a child and maybe had to go time and time again, and people didn't know that that's left its mark inside. It could be events where one was shamed publicly, or bullied relentlessly, or live in an environment where there is constant criticism. As
Sure.
parents, of course, we're trying to guide our children, but we can get into habits of pointing out what they need to improve far more than celebrating what they've achieved. And my wisdom to the people in my life is that really, if you're going to criticize, you need to only do that when you've got a good relationship. And if you're going to criticize, you need to balance it. Probably the potential of criticism, if it's misplaced to cause harm, can leave a legacy for some people. So criticism that breaks or crushes a person, rather than in a context where you are being built up, and then you're pointed and guided as to how you might do better or improve or learn a skill better. There's a big contrast to those environments. So growing up in an environment where there is constant relentless criticism, you don't realize it. We haven't quite grasped, but that type of environment can actually have lasting effects on us. And it may
Yeah, I
be
just
that
want
that
to,
happens in adults with a relationship or with
yeah,
your boss who is constant. For 10 years, you work in an environment where you're just constantly criticised or feeling crushed. That in itself is trauma with a little t, but can have deep seated wounds, like the wounds of a bullet that looks tiny, but actually is quite explosive inside.
yeah. I want to circle back on those things that you were talking about, the little t traumas, because the big T traumas are easy to identify in lots of ways, and we can see the impact that they've had on our lives, or maybe others see them, maybe more a little, obviously. But the little T traumas are really interesting, and as you've described them, I imagine people listening, lots of people will go, "Oh yeah, I didn't realize that that was trauma. Yes, I was constantly criticized, or yes, I felt alone all the time, or yes, I was bullied relentlessly." But I'm fine. I'm fine.
Hmm.
But interestingly, what you were talking about the sort of whether your foot's on the accelerator or the brake, and sort of it's disproportionate or it's not giving you a smooth ride. I think that's really interesting. So maybe some of those little t traumas do cause that in our lives, and if we're feeling that sense of overwhelm, how do we begin to think, oh, is this a trauma response? And how do we identify that?
Yes, the sort of the concern of raising these issues that is that we end up wrapping everybody in cotton wool. That's not good
Yeah,
for us.
yeah,
Okay. A few knocks and scrapes help us learn to keep ourselves safe in the future. If you've never felt pain physically because you've been so protected, when the first time you feel pain, it can actually, that in itself then is because you've not prepared, you've not learnt how to understand it. So I guess sometimes we don't know if, for example, as children, we've been emotionally neglected. Um, and it may feel really challenging to consider our childhood with what might feel like a critical eye. And what I would say is that it's important when we reflect back to things that may have resulted in trauma, because not everything would. When we start to see the symptoms of trauma, emotional trauma, which I will go into in a moment, um, when we start to see those, the response needs to be what is required to meet that need now, rather than whose fault is it.
right. That's helpful.
Okay. Because I think sometimes, we can look back and say, yes, I was emotionally neglected in this context, and that's meant that I haven't learnt the skills to keep myself calm and soothed and whatever in later life. But the person who was your caregiver is likely to have had similar. That's the nature of what we have. And so we need to be able to look back with compassion for ourselves, compassion for the environment that we are in, and looking at how we can undo the harm that has been done or bring about healing, having a mind and a heart to move forward and to be healed is so much more important, because sometimes going back and pointing the finger at, what is the point of me getting angry with the football pitch that I twisted my ankle on? Yes, it could be the groundsman didn't do it right. Yes, it could be they made me play and it was slightly rainy. Lots of reasons why I was put at risk in that environment. But the most important task now is to heal my ankle so I can get out and play football again. And emotionally, if we have unresolved trauma, or we just get preoccupied with why it's there, or why I am wired the way I am, why I am hyper volatile or in denial and not wanting to address feelings, if the only thing we're looking for is the blame, rather than, okay, this isn't the way I want to be, is there a way to move out of this? Or maybe even thinking about, gosh, if the way I was brought up affected me, what can I do to make sure the next generation are blessed because I've done some of the work at restoring that?
Yeah.
So I hope
Yeah.
that helps. But the sort of thing that trauma can do it the emotional trauma that I'm talking about now is it does damage us, our brain, which then impacts us emotionally in the way we express our emotions. It can damage us physically. So it can mean that our not only our high alert of emotional threat is disproportionate, but our
Mm.
body's high alert to physical threat. So it may be we feel pain more acutely and more quickly than another person. Our alarm system of our body that says, oh, you've got achy joints, is more distracting to us than it might be for somebody else. So people who have chronic trauma may get more exaggerated physical symptoms that are based on true pathology, but it can be amplified. Okay. So my alarm system emotionally, it might be that I have the reaction to a small criticism as if a lion's about to attack me. So I
Right.
come out fighting. And in my soul, in my heart, I know that's like disproportionate, but it is such a knee-jerk reaction that I don't know how to stop it. And so I find other ways, perhaps unhealthy ways, to manage that. Maybe I become a perfectionist because I'm so fearful of being crushed by one little criticism and I
Yeah.
can't cope with that. Um, and then the other, as I was trying to allude, it can affect our bodies physically. So we may be more at risk of getting allergies, responding to our environment in a hyper alert way. We may find that we get headaches more quickly than others. We get gastrointestinal symptoms. We may get irritable bowel. So there are the way the body reacts to stresses around us
Mhm.
that most people would manage okay, it reacts disproportionately. Um, so that the trauma I'm trying to explain can affect us emotionally in the way we react, but also physically in the way our body reacts. And I think it can also affect us spiritually. So, for example, we grow up because of these little t silent little bullets that have been going into us as we were growing up, but it distorts our image of God. And we may
Mhm.
decide that God didn't protect me, therefore he doesn't love me.
Sure.
Or it may affect our identity. Somehow I'm damaged goods and I can never be anything but I'm unworthy of love. And even though I know in my mind I am loved, because within me I still carry that deep sense that's settled within me that I'm unworthy of love, it's hard for me to be loved, to allow others to love me, to receive love, let
So
alone to love
there's like
others
an
in a
earning
healthy
thing and a
way.
legalism that can kind of creep in. Yeah.
Um, and the other thing is it can steal our joy. Um, because you're hyper vigilant, you're waiting for the next threat because you can't quite believe it's a good day today. You can't relax into it and
Sure.
immerse yourself in a good, safe environment because you're ready for the attack, whatever form that might be, the little t or the big T. It may have been a trauma, like you were in a war zone, and you've ended up with what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. So your body is now rewired, ready. It's a survival mechanism. You've heightened the survival design God has given you to be able to get out of, but that is just constantly switched on, and it means you
Sure.
cannot easily find peace. It's unusual for you to feel peace. So those are the sort of things that would start to make us think, gosh, is there something that I need to address, or I need help to address, or I need help to pray about, to bring about? Acknowledging it's there is the first step.
Yeah, so I was going to come on to just this and say, well, how do we approach a healing process, both in a psychological sense, but then also in a spiritual sense, because we do worship the Prince of Peace. We do invite the Holy Spirit to come and do that work in us. And how do we marry that with a medical or psychological process of healing? What does that look like?
The, the way we're wired, all of us, is that we have our survival part of our brain. People will talk about it as the amygdala. It's the bit that is the sparky bit that helps you deal with a crisis. Somehow you've got superhuman strength to deal with the crisis, and you're fine. And you can almost imagine there are three components to the way we're wired. And so you've got this threat area, the survival area, which is really important. But there's also an area of our emotional development which is about self-soothing, is about being able to be calm, be still, to relax, to recover perhaps from the stressful time. And then there's the problem solving area, okay, of our brains, of our minds. And when people have been exposed to relentless stress of some level, it appears that the threat area, well, it can actually become bigger. So it's not just an emotional thing, there's a physical transformation that happens within the brain. So the amygdala, that tiny little part of the brain, becomes disproportionately bigger. And it may be that as we were growing up and we didn't have a lot of soothing and calming and reassurance, and maybe we were only ever told the practical ways of living, and when we were in distress we had to find a way of solving that ourselves because maybe our parent wasn't present or wasn't able or was unwell or didn't know how to soothe themselves, so they got alarmed and that would alarm us. So the soothing area hasn't grown. And it may be that our problem solving, the way we have solved that, is to become a problem solver, but we still don't learn to soothe ourselves.
Right.
And the key thing for healing, both physically, spiritually, and emotionally, is to comprehend the need that there's a right place and time for the alarm centre. But if that is constantly on the go, it is likely that your self-soothing area hasn't developed enough. That's the most likely thing. The problem solving may be too big because you may become, a perfectionist who is a real achievement driven person, and you live the life of either alarm or having to strive and strive and strive. So we never enter into that peaceful side. And in my understanding of spiritual disciplines, they really complement what I understand as a psychiatrist. And so that part of growing that self-soothing side is a really important part, however you do it. And it may be that through prayer and spiritual discipline and the support of being in a healthy spiritual community, where we can be vulnerable, where we can be real, where we can work out the fact that we're a volatile person and we don't want to be, where we can be loved unconditionally and loved without an agenda and loved before we are transformed, while we're being transformed. All those things can bring about healing, but it may be that one also needs to have some expert help, particularly if we start to realise just how damaged certain environments or damaging certain environments in our lives, whether the little t or the big T traumas, have been to us, and particularly if we are leading others, guiding others, caring for others, and we're seeing a few red flags that the way we react emotionally doesn't fit with what we believe, what we want to, how we want to be. And it may be there that we need a good combination, just like, the person with the broken leg. we need to heal. We need to allow time to heal. And a prayer can heal us instantly, but it often doesn't. And as we pray for that leg to be healed, I have a dear friend who's in hospital now with 2 broken legs after horrible trauma, and we are praying and we are journeying with her. And we are seeing God work. It's phenomenal. It's happening at the rate that God designed. And so we would love to relieve her instantly of that pain that she's having to go through. But it doesn't always happen that way. And I would love to think that emotional, deep-seated trauma could be healed every time by one prayer. It doesn't always happen. But if you're called to pray with and for somebody who is dealing with trauma in their lives, then be prepared to walk the journey, which won't necessarily happen overnight, and see God working and unfolding and bringing healing that he has designed for us. There is healing there. It is possible to be healed. We may need the doctors, just like my friend needs the doctors to do the surgery, to know what to do, to give the antibiotics, to protect her as she is healing. So we may need the psychologists or the psychiatrists or the specially trained people who understand about trauma to help us journey. But it is something that only God will bring, that ultimate healing. And I believe God heals Christians and non-Christians. God has designed our bodies that they will be healed. But when our eyes are opened as to the amazing work of God's transforming care for us, when he brings healing physically, mentally and spiritually, it just makes us want to worship him.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a really helpful picture of how the brain works and how when one side is, or when part of it is the wrong side, it's taking up too much room. What that does.
Overdeveloped.
Overdeveloped, very good. That it impacts the way that the rest of the brain is going to function, and that's a really helpful image. I think as well as a church community, when we're journeying together, part of that is relating to one another, and often in it's in relating to one another that it highlights some of maybe some of that trauma that's happened to us and in us, and that makes us be the way we are or react the way that we do. And I just am aware of that, aware of the role of the church, not only in the healing, but also in the revealing of really who
Mm,
we are. And I think that's one of the gifts. I was just thinking as you were talking about some of the spiritual disciplines, including something like Sabbath, which is
mm,
sort of the command to rest, to have no agenda, to be in the presence of the King, the Prince of Peace, and allow him to minister to you without having to work or achieve or perfect anything.
mm,
And then the gift of community to make us uncomfortable at times and reveal some of that stuff that we've managed to hide and suppress. These things are gifts to us, but they're often the
mm,
things that make us uncomfortable, aren't they?
mm.
Um,
Yes.
and journeying with trauma, with our childhoods or with the big T traumas or with the things that have happened throughout our lives. It's not a comfortable, easy process, is it? What does
I
that look
think
like in terms of, I was just going to say, like, what does that look like?
I think I think shame is, we've sort of touched on that before, and I
Yeah,
know in previous podcasts as well. And I think if we're in an environment that feels judgmental, and that environment might be in our own heads,
sure.
where to admit that you are angry means you never, because you don't admit it, you're suppressing it, you're pretending it's not there, you're doing everything. And the moment somebody says, "Why are you so angry?" You say, "I'm not, I'm just frustrated." We're not acknowledging that something within us is enraged. for example. And the risk of some environments and some communities is that there is a prohibition about emotional expression that means then this wounded self that may be enraged at some level. It could be just the toddler that never learnt to, wasn't ever comforted and told how to calm themselves, and doesn't know that's possible, doesn't know how to do it. And the only way is to just let out that rage, and then you're living with this fear of holding back this tiger within you that feels dangerous, because we can be given messages that somehow to be angry is dangerous. And then we never learn to spot anger and soothe it.
Yes.
And emotions that can impact our behaviour towards the very people we love need to be welcomed into the room and allowed their place so that they can be soothed and settled and prayed over and prayed for. So I imagine, I just imagine these little balls of emotion in the room with me now, okay? And over in that corner, there's joy. Oh, I like joy. I'll let joy in the room. And there's happiness and there's peace. And this is all I ever want. But actually lurking behind that cupboard is a huge lump of anger. It's huge. It's ugly. And I don't want to even notice it. In fact, I'll turn my sense away from anger or resentment or, I don't know, disgust or whatever. And I won't allow it in the room, but it's there. And the moment I take my eye off joy, it's jumping out and I'm pushing it back in. I'm just trying to give you a picture of how,
Yeah.
when we haven't settled and soothed those deep, deep emotions and allowed them to help them become safe, they become bigger and uglier and
Yeah.
scarier. And then we do more of the hard work of suppressing them by becoming perfectionists, by achieving, by whatever. And we only end up with those two resources of control and hard work, or explosion, because
Yeah.
they jumped out at the wrong time and I didn't want them there.
Yeah.
Whereas if I can actually acknowledge, wow, in this moment I'm feeling angry, it's the first step. It may then trigger into an outburst, but the moment I can start to acknowledge that was anger, and I'm not going to beat myself up for being angry. I've got to be curious about, why am I angry?
Yeah. It
What's
strikes
behind
me,
that?
yeah, it strikes me that this is actually about intentionality. And
Mm,
one of the fruits of the spirit is self-control. And I wonder whether there's something about knowing ourselves intentionally and stepping with the spirit, in step with the spirit, allowing him to help us to
yes.
not just not feel, because that's not what the role of the spirit is. The role of the spirit is to help us to feel, but
Mm,
also be intentional about what we do with that. And that's the
mm.
fruit of self-control, isn't it? That's being able to feel and also not
It
allowing
is.
our that overwhelm to come. And that's a journey, isn't it? That doesn't happen overnight,
Well,
like what you were
how do
talking
we
about.
grow fruit? How do we
Yeah.
grow fruit? You know, we don't like, the problem is, again, shame can get in the way of us
Yeah.
then realizing, where do we go?
Mm,
What do we do? What's our
yeah.
role in growing that fruit? The only thing we need to do to develop the fruit is allow God to do it.
Mm,
Okay? I can't, if I'm a tomato plant, I can't squeeze out more tomatoes just because I want to be more self-controlled.
yes.
It's
Yes.
not, it doesn't happen that
Yes.
way. I
No.
need to be watered. I need to be fed. I need the gardener. I need to allow the gardener
Mm,
We need to give them permission so that that fruit will grow, and it will grow as we align ourselves with Christ, as we immerse ourselves in Scripture, as we spend time and allow that self-soothing side of a Sabbath rest to
Yeah.
become intentional throughout our day to some extent, to have moments to be present with God with no agenda other than to experience his soothing, to allow that part of our identity, our bodies, our brains to grow because God is doing that. I mean, when it says in the Bible, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, this is God working on a cellular, neurological, emotional, spiritual. We are one, we are physical, mental, spiritual beings. And
Yeah.
when God is renewing our mind, this is what he's doing. And if you look at all the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control, all of
Gentleness.
these, and
Yeah.
gentleness, all of these are about relationship. They are expressed in relationship. So let that first relationship be between you and God,
Yeah. Yeah.
that will allow, as he feeds you, that fruit will grow. And yes, look at the psychological, learn about trauma, learn about it, find somebody who's informed in that way, encourage your minister or yourself to learn, so that when you're with people, we aren't just burdening them with you need more self-control over your
Yes.
anger, but we are welcoming them to feel safe, that it's okay. It's not okay to be angry out of control, but it's okay to have anger and learn to control it.
Yeah, very good. Very good. That's a wonderful message of hope, actually, that you might identify with some of the things that we've been talking about. And people listening might go, I didn't know I was like that. I didn't know I had trauma. This might be a bit of a wake-up call to realise that those things are happening. But what a message of hope that actually, through our relationship with God, through our intentional looking at ourselves and asking God to come and fill us and spending time in that presence, growing that peace intentionally, that there is hope. These things aren't going to control us forever. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hilary. Really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Thank you so much.